Utah and BYU might not be playing this year, but who would win in the 2022 matchup if the two teams did face off?
You are Locked On Utes, your daily podcast on the Utah Utes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome into a special Locked On crossover podcast with Locked On Utes and Locked On Cougars. I'm JT Wistrcill, joined by Jake Hatch to talk about one of the best rivalries in college sports. Unfortunately, we don't have it this year, Jake, but BYU versus Utah, always fun to talk about this great rivalry.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks. By the way, JT, it is a pleasure to be back on Locked On Utes. You're doing a killer job with the relaunch of this podcast. But thank you for the invite. And yes, what is better than to talk about than the Holy War?
100%. It's so great. You get fans. So last year was my first introduction in terms of going in person to a game, which of course it's kind of funny because Utah had the one at 9 years straight, and then they finally lose the one I go to. But it was such a fun game to be at still, at least for me, because I was like, this atmosphere is what college football is all about. So I've never had more fun probably the game where my team lost. Yes, I was bummed, but it was just like, I can see what makes this rivalry so great because I've yet to go to a game when Utah has hosted it. So it's definitely a bummer we won't get it this year. And I don't know about you, Jake, because we're going to talk about it. I think it would be an awesome game if these two teams did face off. I am curious, as you cover the Cougars so much, what are your thoughts on this Utah team? As someone who used to host Locked On Utes.
Well, let me first off say, I guess Utah fans direct your hate at JT for that loss last year because he's the bad luck charm apparently showing up.
Yes,
when Utah losing. But moving on to my thoughts on Utah, I'm actually really intrigued to see what Utah does this year, kind of an encore to that Rose Bowl season a year ago. A phenomenal year for the Utes by any measure. You make the Rose Bowl, in my mind, you have accomplished one of the great things in college football. I'm a kid who absolutely loves college football. It's my favorite sport, bar none. It's number one in my book. And to watch a program that I covered for a time doing Locked On Utes, I cover in my day-to-day job with the KSL Sports Zone over there. The fun part was seeing them in Pasadena on January 1. It was just so fun to see that out there in the Rose Bowl and just enjoying that. So the biggest thing this year is what can they do for the encore? Can they make another run at the Roses? Can they potentially be a college football playoff contender as well if they have one of those undefeated type seasons? We'll see what happens. But the biggest thing for me is I think Utah is well prepared and loaded to make another run at it. That's the good news if you're a Utah fan.
Yeah, I feel the same way about Utah, obviously, and I feel like BYU's in the same position of having a very strong season as well. Especially, you look at what a great year they had last year, excluding kind of the bowl game. But that was kind of a weird thing. They obviously thought they deserved better than what they ended up, and the committee did definitely slight them as well. But I mean, that was a team that had so many great wins last year, and you look at some of the injuries they had on the defensive side of the ball as well. Could have been even better last year. So that's something very interesting. Offensively, return a lot of guys. So I think BYU's in for a big year as well. I think they're an 8-4, 7-5 team, maybe even 9-3 team. I think this is a really good team. And they got a lot of fun games this year as well, Jake.
Well, and that's the thing about it with BYU is it's the final year of independence. They're going into the Big 12 next year, but their final season is going to leave BYU fans wanting more because they're playing a number of Power 5 teams. They got Baylor on the schedule. They got Notre Dame. They got Arkansas. They got Oregon. They got Stanford. Those are the Power 5 games. Then you also have the Utah State game. You got Boise State. So there's a lot of intrigue for the Cougars. That's the positive news if you're a BYU fan. And I think there's a lot of BYU fans that look at what Utah's done the past decade, having opportunities to compete for a Pac-12 title. And that's one thing that they've kind of been missing out on is the opportunity to play for a conference championship. And beginning 2023, a year from now, BYU will officially be part of the Big 12 and competing for a Big 12 championship. And I think BYU fans are very much going to be looking forward to that because it's kind of the one thing that's been lacking for the better part of a decade with BYU running as an independent.
For sure, it is going to be very exciting. And those, once you are able to capture that conference championship, it does mean something special. You work so hard for your season, and then you take the month off for a bowl game. So it's kind of weird having your championship game. It's the only sport like that where there is such a large gap between your final game, really. So definitely something interesting that BYU is now going to have an opportunity to compete for. But before all of that discussion ensues about how they'll do in the Big 12, I think one of the fun things to talk about is who would win in a matchup this year between the Cougars and the Utes. Last year, we already talked about it. BYU got the big win at home, and they're a strong team as well again this year. So are the Utes. So it would be a really fun game if the Holy War was able to happen this year. Unfortunately, it's not, but we're going to break down what would hypothetically happen, in our opinion, if these two teams did play. So we're going to start off by looking at how Utah's offense would fare against BYU's defense. So, Jake, who do you think is the edge in that matchup and why?
Well, okay, let me acknowledge this right up front. With Cameron Rising, Utah's offense is infinitely more dangerous than when they faced BYU last year. It's nothing against Utah, but they made the wrong decision with the quarterback last year to start the season. I mean, there's no arguing that. So here's the thing. Utah's offense is going to be absolutely awesome this year. I'm fully expecting them to be lights out. I think the tight end position is absolutely stacked with guys like Brant Keithy as well as Dalton Kincaid there. I think that Cameron Rising is a potential NFL guy. There's some early hype for him as being a dark horse first-round draft pick. The running back position sure looks like it is well on its way to being one of the premier positions once again for the Utes. The wide receiver position looks pretty well stocked, and the offensive line looks good. So I think that it would actually be a better matchup for BYU's defense than it was a year ago, just simply due to the upgrade at quarterback play. Now, BYU, when they faced Utah last year, was near 100% health-wise with regards to their defense. So the biggest thing is in the Utah game, they had the likes of Keenan Peely, Peyton Wilgar, Chaz Ayu, all guys who later in the season suffered season-ending injuries, and that contributed to the malaise, the fall-off that BYU's defense had a year ago, especially the tail end of the season. They were a shell of their former selves on defense in the back half of last season. I'm not trying to say that as an excuse. It's just simply facts is when you have health, it gives you a better opportunity. So right now, if Cameron Rising were leading this Utah offense, I would give the slight edge to Utah offensively just due to the fact that they have a lot of continuity and BYU is bringing back guys off of injury. You're not 100% certain how they would do. I'm also saying this in the sense that we would probably see this game if it were being played early on this season, the first, second, or third game of the year. So there's guys like Keenan Peely coming back off an ACL tear, Peyton Wilgar with shoulder issues. Chaz Ayu had multiple ailments that he forced him out last season. If any of them were limited early on this season, that I think would give the edge even more to Utah. But I think as it is, if you had both of these units, Utah's offense going against BYU's defense at 100%, with Cameron Rising, Bad Moon himself leading the Utes on offense, I would give the slight edge to the Utes.
That's how you know it used to be Locked On Utes host right there. The Bad Moon Rising reference. I love it, Jake. And I think 100%. I kind of mentioned it in the opening early on, talking about BYU's defense as well, with that Utah got more of what made BYU's defense early on in the season. And if you look at some of those end of the season numbers, they are very deceptive because of all those injuries. But I also agree with you as well that with Cam Rising in there, I think it would be a great battle in the trenches between these two teams. You get a guy like Braden Daniels, and you also get a guy like Tyler Batty, who is another guy who's going to be in the NFL discussion as well. So I think it would be a lot of fun to watch. And that's a battle that BYU absolutely dominated last year. Utah really struggled to run the football against that BYU front a year ago. And I would really be excited to see that battle as well. But they do have a quarterback now who the game falls like that. You even mentioned a guy like Dalton Kincaid who got more comfortable as the season wore on as well. Tavion Thomas kind of cleaned up the fumbling issues. And this year, I think it's also one of those things where I think Tavion is going to have a good year, but if he struggles a little bit, there's a guy in Jalen Glover who's knocking on the door and going to come up next there. But I think it would be a fun matchup. I think there's a guy for Utah and Devon Vele who has a really good chance to have a strong breakout season, but there's also some guys when we're talking about BYU. I'm looking at guys like the Vanderbilt transfer, Gabe Judy Lally. Did I say his name right, Jake? Yeah. So get a Vanderbilt transfer coming over. We already know what a guy like Malik Moore can do in the secondary as well. So watching the chess match kind of between him and Rising, I think would be really fun to see how it plays as well. And like you mentioned as well, this game, if it was played, would also be earlier in the season. And we're going to talk about it kind of later on, like the different variables of this game. If it was played at BYU, if it was played at Utah. If this game was played this year, it would more than likely be played at Utah as well. So it's going to be nice and quiet when the offense is trying to go to work, which would definitely be another boost for Utah as well. But I agree with you. I think Cam Rising being in there, especially being early in the season, gives the Utes the slight edge.
I want to ask you one question on this, JT. Just you've been covering Utah. You went to the U. Is there I guess one facet of the Utah offense that you feel like as compared to it? So essentially going back a year, it's not a full year, obviously, since BYU and Utah last played, but is there a unit outside the quarterback position that you feel like is more well established than they were last year when BYU and the Cougars squared off, Utes and the Cougars squared off?
Yeah, I think Tavion Thomas had by no means had grips on running back one at that point as he's coming into the season as running back one. And we know anything can change that depending on a bad game. And he struggled with fumble issues early in the year. So that's something that could definitely take effect. But I would say him for sure. One thing that ended up helping Utah was kind of like Bam Olaseni really stepped up at left tackle, kind of post. He got a little bit of work in during the BYU game, but he didn't enter that one as the true starter. So it'll be interesting to see how Braden Daniels goes over there. It's a position I think he'll handle well, even though he's going to be an NFL guard. And the other thing I'll say is, it's an interesting thing because I feel like people around Utah, we all expect Devon Vele to break out and feel like he's more established, but by no means is any team going in versus Utah going, we got to stop these wide receivers. So I feel like the receiver position is in better hands this year, even though there isn't a guy like a Britton Covey. And that's something we're not going to really touch on the special teams aspects. That's definitely something that be interesting to see how Utah kind of picks up the lack of is without Covey. But guys like Makai Cope, I think Solomon Enos, even though he's been a reliable guy, not a super productive guy, but a reliable guy. So I think the receiver position and the running back would probably be the two I look for in that regard. And are there any with BYU that you feel that way about?
The funny thing about this, BYU ran the ball super effective last year. I'll know that. Tyler Algier had an absolutely monster season. I'm telling you, this offensive line for BYU, and we're going to talk more about BYU's offense here in a minute. The offensive line for BYU is absolutely elite, but the thing on the defensive side for BYU that I really liked, it's probably better established than it was a year ago, is the defensive backs, especially the safety group. You mentioned Malik Moore. Malik Moore is going to be BYU's lead safety this year. He's really morphed into a really reliable guy on the back end of BYU's defense. But even that early on last season, you weren't 100% certain on Malik Moore, D'Angelo Mandel. You had guys like Isaiah Heron out there, Caleb Hayes at the cornerback spots. Just the rotation hadn't really settled itself. The nice part is BYU's defensive secondary sure looks a lot more established this year. You mentioned Gabe Judy Lally, the grad transfer coming in from Vanderbilt. He figures to enter the mix as a potential starter right away for BYU as well. So if you were to ask for one of those, I'd probably say the defensive backfield is a sure lot more set than it was a year ago for the Cougars.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, you mentioned Gabe again. I appreciate you reassuring me on the pronunciation. Me and Jake actually worked together last year calling football games. And that very first game me and Jake did together, there were points in that game I was just handing Jake my roster sheet being like, take the pronunciation. I don't got it. So I appreciate that you're always there to bail me out.
Yeah, I got you, man. And looking forward to, by the way, another great high school season to come.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun one. A lot of good talent in the state. And as we know, there's a lot of great college teams in the state as well. We're breaking it down here. We're going to move on to the defensive side of the ball for the Utes and the offensive side for the Cougars in just a moment. But first, I want to use this opportunity to tell you guys about BetOnline Net. BetOnline Net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your betting needs. Find all your favorite sports and events at the #1 online source for odds, lines, and games. With college football and NFL season right around the corner, as well as Major League Baseball still in the swing of things firmly post All-Star break. There is a ton of great lines out there for you guys to take advantage of, and I would highly encourage you to do it BetOnline Net. The national media is always lower on teams from Utah, as you guys know, so it's a great time to get in, cash in at BetOnline, where they continue to be the top online resource for all your sports wagering information, from live in-game betting scores and podcasts. They have you covered. BetOnline, where the game starts. Okay, so looking at it, we talked about it. We both gave the Utes the slight edge offensively, but now we're going to turn it over to the other side. And you kind of mentioned this is a BYU team that's really good at running the ball. And even though you lose your lead back last year, you gain a guy in Christopher Brooks. He had interest from Notre Dame, Purdue. So the running game, in my opinion, really shouldn't miss a beat. So I think this is going to be a really fun matchup, especially get guys like Utah. Like, yes, you lost Junior Tafuna as well as a Putu Tau, Junior Tafuna is still there. You lose Tafua. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Mika Tafua, you lose that, but there's still really good guys there. Devin Lloyd not being there, but still solid linebackers. So I think this is a really fun side of the ball. I'm still not entirely sure who I'm going to give the edge to, even Jake. So I would love to hear who you think has it.
So I'm actually going to say that BYU's offense, I feel like, has the edge, especially considering the unsettled nature of Utah's linebackers. And I'm not saying that Utah's linebackers aren't talented. They have a glut of linebackers. It's crazy to look at the roster for Utah. I've looked at it. You have it feels like 25 guys at linebacker for Utah. I know it's a little hyperbole there, but the biggest thing is a guy like Jaren Hall enters now what is going to be his second, maybe you could really consider maybe his third season as a starting quarterback for BYU, but at least his second as the full-time starter for BYU. He should be all that more settled. He should be even more effective than he was against Utah a year ago, and he was plenty effective in that game, especially with his feet running the ball. So I think with the turnover at linebacker for Utah, you lose a guy like Mika Tafua, Hawati Pututau up front for Utah. They're going to just reload their defensive line. There's no doubt about that. But I just think with the little bit of an unsettled nature early on this season for Utah with some of those positions, you mentioned Devin Lloyd exiting, Nephi Sewell exiting. I think BYU's offense has the advantage with a veteran offensive line. I think actually a better offensive line than a year ago, an established quarterback who was already very effective against Utah 1 year ago as well. I think BYU's wide receiving core is probably a little thinner than it was a year ago. The tight end position is a little more unsettled, but I think the running game will give BYU the edge in this matchup. But I'd love to hear your rebuttal to that because there's a lot of moving parts, obviously, with both of these teams, and this is a completely hypothetical matchup, but I'm just going off kind of the premise, and we'll talk more about parameters of where this game is being played, that type of stuff. I just think with some of the turnover on the front side of Utah's defense, the front seven, the linebackers, the defensive line would give BYU a slight edge, in my opinion. So essentially, it would be offense versus offense in many ways with the two advantages in my mind.
And I really do agree with that, honestly, because when you look about it, whenever you have two elite quarterbacks, it's always going to be hard to stop a great offense or a really good offense, no matter what it is, because you're still, no matter what the defense is trying to do, you're still reacting or trying to stop what that offense is trying to do. And you got a guy in Jaren Hall, as you mentioned, who is another guy in that first round quarterback conversation for me as well. I think he is a lights out quarterback. We saw what he could do versus Utah. And that was when Utah had, yes, I think Clark Phillips, of course, he was only technically a freshman. He still played the COVID year, so still got some experience, but he was still out there and played really strong. But guys like Travis Brodham were still healthy, and he was really good in that game as well. And that was something that he had no problem still dicing up. And even you get a guy like RJ Hubert and Cole Bishop at safety, who I feel like are still really good safeties. This is one of the best quarterbacks they're going to play all year and is going to be tested. And you mentioned some of the departure of the tight end as well and kind of some of the receivers, but you still got guys in Nakua, in Romney as well, who are experienced, able to get it done. That would definitely test the Utes as well. And there is still no defense for a perfectly placed ball as well. And we know that Hall is capable of doing that. And you talked about this offensive line. I mean, Blake Freeland, Clark Barrington, these are guys who just get it done. And I think it would be an awesome matchup, but I don't think there's many teams in the country that are going to prevent BYU from running the football. So, and we've already mentioned Christopher Brooks, a veteran guy who's going to be tough and get it done in between the tackles. So I think it'll be interesting to see pushed. And no matter when this game is played, it is early in the season. I'm high on Lander Barton. I'm high on Justin Medlock. They're both true freshmen coming in, and this could be one of those games where they go back and watch on tape to me, and they're like, man, that was a rude awakening. I can't believe we played that offensive line, especially maybe, look, they'll get a good taste of it versus a team like Florida, but even Florida doesn't have an offensive line like BYU, especially guys that are so fundamentally and technique-wise so sound. So I'm going to agree with you. I really am. I'm going to give BYU the edge offensively as well, and I think this is going to be a high-scoring game.
Well, and that's the thing about it. I think this would be a game where it'd be more of a classic kind of type of shootout in my mind, just with these two going back and forth. The one thing I think Utah fans, if you're looking at BYU, the biggest thing to pay attention to is Christopher Brooks going behind an offensive line that returns 4 of the 5 starters a year ago. And the 5th guy who was technically not the returning starter was Connor Pay, who started half the games a year ago because James Empey got hurt. So the BYU rush attack, I know that Tyler Algiers off to the NFL. He's going to be with the Atlanta Falcons, and I think he's going to have a fantastic rookie season out there. The biggest thing is I don't see much fall off, and that's the thing. BYU may not have as potent a passing attack as they had against Utah a year ago, but the rush attack, it's going to be, I think, right there. I think it's going to be probably as good and potentially even better just with the returning offensive line that BYU's got up in front. So it'll be interesting.
And I think this is a BYU team as well that's going to run the football on Notre Dame. So that's how good that I think this BYU offensive line. It's not really a slight against Utah, and it's the same thing against Oregon. I think they're going to play Arkansas. All these teams, I expect Brooks to go over 100 yards in it because that's their identity. I think they're going to stay committed to it.
And let me add one thing. Junior Tafuna is a guy that I would love to have at BYU. Like he's the next great Utah defensive tackle that's going to make a boatload of money in the NFL. I love Van Fillinger. I love guys like Miki Suga, Taranga. The Utah defensive line, there's nothing wrong with what they've got. Devin Kafusi, a former BYU Cougar in his own right, a transfer to the University of Utah. He's probably going to start at defensive tackle. The matchup of this offensive versus defensive line for BYU's offense versus Utah's defense would be elite. I feel like BYU is going to have very little fall off with regards to the rush attack. And so it leads me to think that if this game were being played this year, we're looking at maybe one of the kind of the antithetical Utah BYU matchups where traditionally it's been a lower scoring game. This could be a game where both teams are in the 30s. That's probably where we need to go next, is talking more about, okay, what are the other hypotheticals that go into the mix here? But I think this could very much be a game that the winning team scores 30, 40 points.
Totally agree. And you kind of mentioned right off the bat how good Junior Tafuna is. BYU knows that. When you're looking at Utah, I think especially in this first game, he's the guy you're circling, like, let's take him away. Because Van Fillinger is really good, but I think you guys do have the tackles that can hang with him one-on-one. Some plays Fillinger would win, but some plays as well BYU would win. So definitely a fun matchup where we both agree that BYU has the edge. So we've given the edge to both teams. We're going to talk about who we think would then get the eventual win and some of the other factors that would go into this hypothetical matchup in just a moment. But first, I want to tell you guys about Intercap lending. There is a reason that no lender helps more families in Utah with their mortgage needs. Intercap gets deals done. Quick and simple processes. Intercap closes loans 2 weeks faster than the industry average. And though fast is great, the ultimate goal is to create a stress-free home loan process. And that is what Locked On's personal loan officer, Steve Carter, has delivered to hundreds of Locked On listeners so far, including Locked On's founder, David Locke. And let's be honest, if Steve can help keep David on track through the entire process, Steve can help anyone. Intercap is headquartered here in Utah, but licensed to help you with all your mortgage needs in 40 states. Give Steve a call. His direct number is 385-800-8528. You will not find a more responsive loan officer. NMLS number is 190465. That's Intercap lending for all your guys' lending needs. Okay, so we talked about it. This would be a really fun matchup between these two teams. There's a lot of factors and reasons why on the field that we've talked about, but there's a few we haven't as well. Jake, what do you think are some of the things that we would have to factor into this matchup if it was played this year?
Well, number one, it would be played at Rivalry Stadium. BYU got the win on their home turf last year, snapping that 9-game winning streak. And I was at that game. I was sitting in the press box, and just to watch essentially the release of emotion after more than a decade of BYU fans losing this game, the angst, I don't know. It was wild to watch the scenes unfold. Utah owned that rivalry. They're BYU fans. If you're watching this, I know we're doing a crossover here. They're going to be BYU fans are going to be upset with me saying this, but Utah owned that rivalry for the better part of the 2000s. They have owned this century of the rivalry so far. The win for BYU last year was huge in so many different ways for the Cougars, but the biggest thing is if this matchup were to play out this year, it's at Rivalry Stadium. So you automatically give the home field bump to Utah, which has been a place BYU has struggled with since the early 1990s, essentially since Ronnie Mack took over the Utah football program, going to what was then Rice Stadium and now Rivalry Stadium. It's been a little shop of horrors for BYU for many, many years. It's just been a tough place for the Cougars to get wins. Of course, there's the Johnny Harleen play in 2006, all that stuff. But traditionally, when BYU goes to Utah, it is a very, very difficult place for them to get a win.
Yeah, and I think, and the vice versa, I think there are Utah fans who will watch this and hear me kind of sing the praises of BYU, but it's then clear that a lot of them didn't watch this BYU team knock off a lot of other really good teams. And it's fun to watch these two teams play because that's what makes rivalries fun a lot of the times too. And they are a really good team still. So the only game you watched was the kind of the Holy War, then you're missing out, especially at a BYU team that I think is going to get. I think this BYU team is going to knock off one of those Power 5 opponents elements at some point this year and really kind of get people excited for them eventual rival into the Big 12. Even something like, look, it's going to be a tall task to beat Baylor, even coming out there just because of how good that team is. But man, that would be something that would be fun and is definitely on the table. But you made a good point as well, talking about the home field advantage. I came to Utah in 2019 was when I transferred in here, and I'm not counting the weird COVID year because there were no fans in the stands, and that's what gives Utah such a boost are the ruckus fans that pack Rice-Eccles Stadium. I have not seen Utah lose at home, and I think that I just don't see that changing this year as well because of what a boost you get from your home field team as well. I think the fans would really get rocking, and like you mentioned, it's the rivalry, so you get the little extra rah-rahs, the blood pressure a little higher, all of that would factor into it. So I just think it's really tough to win in Rice-Eccles, and because of those reasons we kind of talked about, I think the offense would get a little bit more of a boost, and I do think this would be a tight game, but because Utah's at home, I would give them the edge as well. And I think this is a game where, since Utah's at home, I could see Cam Rising outplaying Jaren Hall. And I think it's going to be a very interesting conversation to see because I think going into the season, Jaren Hall is a guy who is projected to go higher than Cam Rising in the draft right now. I've seen Jaren Hall as high as top 5 in mock drafts, and Cam Rising, by most people's expert opinion, it's not that case as well. So he's going to have a strong year too, but I just think playing at home with that ground game getting going, and I think a guy like Clark Phillips, as great as Jaren Hall is, it just takes that one play, and maybe it's a pick 6 to the house or something, but I think Utah would get that bump being at home where it would be tough for BYU to win.
Well, let me add one thing to this. And just in this hypothetical situation, BYU is a program under Kalani Sitake that's kind of prided itself on being able to play its style of football, regardless if it's on the road or at home. That's kind of what they've aspired to do. The one team in the last couple of years that took BYU kind of out of their style was Baylor. When BYU went to Waco a year ago, Baylor ran roughshod over the Cougars. BYU just seemingly couldn't get out of their own way, and that was very tough to watch. And that's the thing about this, that if this hypothetical game being played out, the other thing we need to acknowledge, I think, JT, is we are anticipating if this game were being played, it's the early part of the season. So I would assume that both teams are near 100% health. If it's week 1, 2, or 3, they don't have the late season momentum or malaise that might have set in just in certain circumstances if it were towards the tail end of the season. There's also the hypothetical that this is like the Las Vegas Bowl all those years ago when these two weren't playing and they put them together in that Las Vegas Bowl, and Utah cruised out to a 35-0 lead. BYU came running back, but just ran out of time and lost 35-28. Like the thing about this is I think that BYU would like to think that they can play their style of football, the type of style that they played a year ago at BYU against the Utes. But you're right. Rice-Eccles Stadium is one of the true home field advantages in all of college football. BYU's got that from the Lavelle Edwards Stadium as well. You mentioned the fact that this is a rivalry. These kids grew up playing against each other in football, basketball, just various youth sports. They know each other. Any player who moves in here from out of the state, the first thing they hear about is the Holy War and the matchup between the Utes and the Cougars. So the pageantry, the juice, the momentum from both sides, the thought processes, how the staffs that know each other so well, because Kalani, A-Rod, the coaching staffs know Kyle Whittingham as well as anybody. There are so many things that go into this matchup, but I look at this and it would be an absolutely phenomenal matchup. I actually I know that this is just, like I said, we're doing this hypothetically. This is a year that I want to see this game played. There have been other years where I'd be like, okay, it's okay to miss it this year. But with two quarterbacks, especially with Cameron Rising and Jaren Hall, who are NFL guys, I think at the worst, they're probably mid-round picks, both of them. To have those two dueling back and forth, we're going to miss out on that because I expect both of them, if they have the type of seasons they're expecting to have this year or they're expected to have, they're probably both bolting for the NFL, and we're not going to see this rivalry on the field again until 2024 unless it's put together in a bowl game. So, there is so much that goes into the calculus of all of this, but I for one, think we're missing out by not seeing this game this year, just simply due to the fact that both of these teams appear to be very loaded, and it could be one of those all-time classic matches with two quarterbacks going toe-to-toe.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Anytime you get two quarterbacks that special on the same field, it's must-see TV. And that's without even mentioning the storylines of, hey, Utah dominated this rivalry BYU got him back. So you're looking at it from, is BYU going to start to take control of this rivalry? Are they going to go in and get a win in Rice-Eccles for a long time? Or is Utah going to wrestle control of the series back to them as well? And you mentioned as well, all the local guys that grew up playing together. There's so many fun things. But to me, the biggest thing is kind of that loss from last year for Utah fans. I think that's why they really want to play it as well. And I think from BYU fans' perspective, it's like, no, we're back too. Like we can hang with you guys. So it would be great to have seen this game be played. And it's unfortunate we can't this year, but either way, it is exciting that we're at least going to get it eventually in 2024.
Okay, so last thing, JT, I think unless you got something else here, let's give our predictions. I'll let you go first, and then I'll respond. But what do you think would play out in this hypothetical matchup?
I think it'd be a good game going into the fourth quarter. I think something's whether it's a Junior Tafuna, maybe it's Junior Tafuna poking the ball out. He's been frustrated all game long, and he gets one loose, or it's a Clark Phillips interception. I think one of the Utes playmakers on defense is able to step up in that Ruckus Hall, whether it's Jaren Hall, maybe he has an interception. Maybe it's one of those games where Jaren Hall goes for 200, 300 yards, and then it just makes that one mistake just because he's on the road in a hostile environment, and that's what allows the Utes to get the win to me. So if I had to pick it, and I'll go Utah, like you mentioned, I really liked kind of in the 30s. I'll go Utah 42, BYU 35.
Okay, and I've got a similar mindset, but I'm going to flip it on you because I don't think Jaren Hall would throw for more than 200 yards in this game if BYU could help it. I think that Aaron Roderick, knowing what he knows of Kyle Whittingham, knowing what he knows of Morgan Scalley, he's going to tell his offensive line and Christopher Brooks, guys, we are running on these fools. We're going to do what we did in 1996 up there at Rice-Eccles Stadium. We're going to run for 300 yards as a team. We're known as a passing team, a finesse team. Let's go show what we did a year ago is no fluke. We can run it down their throat. Kyle Whittingham said it himself in postgame last year. They beat us up in the trenches, and I would have bet money coming into this game that was not going to happen for my team. That's Kyle Whittingham saying that postgame last year. So I actually think BYU would come in with the intent they're going to control the clock, control the possessions, run the ball, and run it effectively and allow Jaren Hall to kind of make plays with his feet and obviously off play action. I would have it BYU 31, Utah 28. I think BYU would make it 2 in a row, and Utah fans would be all the more irate.
Well, no matter what you thought we talked about on this podcast, it is not surprising that we both sided with the schools that we get the money from to talk about.
Hey, Homer Radio, let's go.
Oh, I got to do it. One thing we for sure agree about this on, though, Jake, it would be an unbelievable game.
Yeah, and that's the thing about that. We're missing out this year because it just appears these two teams would just be absolutely, I think, at the peak of their powers. There's not a BYU team that's struggling to get to a bowl game. It's a Utah team that's coming off a Rose Bowl. BYU won 10 games a year ago in a season they thought we're going to have a rebuilding year. It feels like this was the type of game that if it were happening, it would have been one of the more hyped matchups in the past decade or so.
100% agree. Now, before I get you out of here, just because you were the former host of Locked On Utes, I want to ask you about your prediction about Utah's season, but I'll throw mine in for BYU as well. I gave them some love early on. I think this is a team that is going to go 8-4. I think they will be a top 20 ranked teams because all those losses are going to be against good teams for the most part. I do think they get one of those Power 5 opponents and get an upset, and then maybe drop one as well. That's kind of where the 8-4 ranking comes in for me. But I think, like I mentioned, I'm already high on Jaren Hall. I think it's a really good BYU team. And for me, they're a top 20 team.
Okay. Utah-wise, I look at this. There is one key game early in the season. That's the game at Florida. You're making the trip to Gainesville. I know that there are going to be a ton of Utah fans there in the swamp. I feel like that game is going to be a big measuring stick early on for how Utah is going to respond to the pressure that they're facing this season. There's a lot of people out there who are saying that they are college football playoff contenders or dark horse playoff contenders. There's a lot of people who's picking them to repeat as Pac-12 champions and make another run to the Rose Bowl at minimum. I think how they respond to that environment playing at Florida is going to tell us a lot about them. But then the key stretch I see for Utah comes in early October. It goes October 1, Oregon State comes to Salt Lake City. Then Utah is at UCLA, and then they finish off that 3-game stretch with a home game against USC. If Utah goes 2-1, at least in that run there, I think Utah is gunning for at least 10-2, possibly an 11-1 season, and then very much in the mix for the playoffs / Rose Bowl conversation. But those are, I guess, those are the 4 games I think are the keys in my mind for Utah. If they navigate that stretch 3-1, yeah, 11-1, at least 10-2 at the very worst is very much in the mix for Utah. I'm fully expecting, and their BYU fans are probably going to roll over here and just scream at me on the radio or on at their YouTube screen. But I think Utah's making another run of the Rose Bowl. I really do.
Yeah, and I feel the same way. This is a team I feel like they're going to end up going 11-1 and be in that same position. And depending on who that one loss is to, they'll have a really good chance to set themselves up for the college football playoff.
Yeah, and so just to give you one thing on the BYU front, I've had a lot of people asking me all off season long, where do you think BYU is going? I've set my benchmark for success for BYU at 9-3. You win nine games, I think it's a successful season. Anything over that is gravy on top. You go 10-11, sure, that's fantastic for BYU. I think 9 wins, 9-3 is kind of where I pegged BYU, and I'm with you. I think they could be a top 20 team at 9-3, especially considering the likes of you're facing an Arkansas team that could be top 20 when you face them. Notre Dame, if Notre Dame gets off to the start we expect, they're top 5 at worst when BYU sees them in Las Vegas. You got Oregon up there at Oregon. You got Baylor coming to Provo. There's a big opportunity for BYU, and I've got them sitting 9-3 is my prediction.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun year for both the teams. It's unfortunate we can't see him play, but that's how we think it would hypothetically play out. So huge thanks to Jake Hatch for joining us. You can follow him at Jacob C. Hatch on Twitter. I'm JT Wistrcill at JT Wistrcill on Twitter. Make sure you guys, if you are listening for your second listen, depending on if you guys are Locked On Utes first or Locked On Cougars, check out the opposing feed, as well as the tons of other great content we have on the Locked On Podcast Network, including Locked On Pac-12 as well. Thank you, Jake, so much for joining us. This has been a Locked On crossover between Locked On Utes and Locked On Cougars.